Hello and welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks. And this week I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Rice from our SM&RT risk transfer team. Welcome along, Chris. And this week we talk about a LawDeb survey into employer sentiment around DB risk, regulatory intervention, a regulator growth drive initiative from the government, and the spring update. Okay, Chris, our first story today, we're going to look at a survey conducted by LawDeb, looking at DB scheme sponsors and their attitude to risk and when they're considering their DB scheme. And the findings are quite interesting, and that 93% of the schemes surveyed believe that the pension scheme posed a risk, with 7% seeing it as a significant risk and 57% as a moderate risk. And so that's quite interesting. I don't know if you've got a view on how that makes us think about the world of pensions and what the direction of travel is, risk transfer, run on those kind of things.
Definitely. I think it's probably a little bit of a surprise that it's so negative. Perhaps we put that down to finance directors having a long memory rather than a short one. I think what we hear in the market is, like you say, lots of schemes in surplus, finance directors rubbing their hands, looking to get their hands on it and carry on running the scheme and grow the surplus. But actually, they still see it as a risk. They remember that they could very quickly, things could change. They could be back where they were in the 2010s and onwards, looking at massive deficits and it taking up an awful lot of their time. But then also that boards don't just think about the money. There's all the other reputational, ESG, cyber risks associated with the scheme. So it doesn't necessarily bode brilliantly for the view that lots of schemes want to run on and then invest in the productive finance that the government's keen to see happen.
Yeah. No, I was interested as well to see that the cyber and ESG issues picked up in here, because I think as most pension trustees listening to this will know, thanks to the general code, cyber risk has been something that we've been talking about a lot more and understanding the implications of that. And that is, there's a lot of data in pension schemes flying around, and the interactions between employers and the pension schemes is definitely a risk area. And the ESG stuff as well, not being aligned, is definitely very interesting. Another area where we've seen discussions between trustees and employers, where it's often the employer that drives that ESG conversation, where things might be misaligned, and trustees might be taking a different view of return and risk and the ESG elements of that. So yeah, really interesting survey from LawDeb.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it just points to all these things, time and management, that take away from the business. So perhaps I would see this doing a buyouts. Buyouts are the way.
Okay, Chris, I'm glad I've got an actuary with me today to talk about a regulatory report, independent report on a DB valuation case involving the MGN pension scheme and Reach PLC. Can you tell us about this?
Glad you got an actuary present. Oh, that's not something I hear every day. That's a great start. This is an interesting case. Initially, when I read it from the regulator, I was a little bit cynical on the basis it's a little bit of backslapping that they'd achieved an outcome. But I think the point of it, obviously we'll do a little bit of that. The point of it is to illustrate to trustees what they might do if they got involved. And it's actually quite reassuring. This actually involved the 2019 valuation that they couldn't reach agreement, so it was reported, as you'd expect, through the usual way, through exchange. And the supervision team became involved to try and cajole the trustee and employer to agreeing it, and didn't get very far, by which time the 2022 valuation needed to be agreed. And then it was passed to the enforcement team. Now, the enforcement team didn't do anything further, I think, other than use a much larger stick. And that was what caused the result and a higher recovery plan, which means the scheme will be funded by 2028. So I think the message to take away from it is the regulator will threaten to use their stick, but I don't think they want to, which is good news. That it's best that everybody could reach a sensible agreement without needing to have enforcement powers levied.
Can you just remind me, what is the stick? You're being euphemistic, but what is the stick? What can they do?
They can impose a schedule of contributions, recovery plan, and statement of funding principles. So decide on the deficit and decide how quickly the company has to pay that deficit off. Hopefully they would do something sensible and consider the company's availability of cash in that, but surely the company being able to drive that and considering that in line with their business plans and agreeing with the trustees would be preferable.
Yeah.
So Dave, we've had the launch of the government's action plan to reform the regulatory system to help support industrial strategy and growth. What are we expecting to come out of that?
Well, yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I think the reaction, I'll just start with the initial reaction really has been pretty skeptical that regulators can in any way drive growth. So I'll park the skepticism just there for now, have that in the back of your mind as we talk through this, as how effective a lot of this stuff will be. Yeah, so the government is keen to tackle the complexity and burden of regulation on industry and businesses, reduce uncertainty and challenge and shift excess risk aversion. Some people with long memories in pensions might remember was it reckless prudence in pensions as well a long time ago. So maybe we're having a revisit of that type of thinking. So the government wants regulators to think differently and to push growth, the growth agenda again. And within this document, the pensions regulator has given their pledges to things they will do to help this drive. And there are 4 of them, and I'm going to sort of half read them to make sure I don't get them wrong. So the first one involves capital reserving and master trusts to free up millions of pounds for schemes by the end of 2025-26. An innovation framework will be developed to trial pensions, innovations, ideas, and so they're going to have a hub. Who doesn't love a hub? So that sounds fantastic. So the autumn of 25, they're going to build that. This bit might make people more interested. Reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens and improve data and data sharing. And that's going to happen over 25-26. And that includes reviewing the scheme return, supervisory return data collections required by March 26. So those of us who are just right now in the middle of scheme return, I won't call it hell, but you're doing it right now, might be breathing a small sigh of relief that next year might be easier. And encourage consolidation and consideration of investment in productive assets. So this is again a hint to the sort of value for the members framework, to the mega funds that the government wants. And the regulator's already been saying the last few weeks, they're changing regulatory style to a prudential regulator away from a compliance-based regulator, reflecting that they're expecting to regulate fewer larger pension schemes in the future. And so looking at more systemic risks rather than very focused on how individual schemes behave, more looking at things in sort of a holistic way. So I think we'll be hoping to see simplification coming through in data collection, rationalization for small schemes, perhaps more proportionality for small schemes, because there's a lot of data, especially around the funding codes. I know that we've been talking a lot about on Pensions in 10 and also in our submissions to the regulator last year when they were consulting on the funding code, as saying, you're asking a lot from small schemes and that's a real drag. And the employer often meets the cost of that. So it's a real drag on them. So making that more proportionate would be a really great outcome if we can get through to regulator. And I know they're a data-driven regulator, so they're going to be fighting that internally, what data they need to regulate the industry properly, but what actually will they rely on? And also where there's multiple ways of getting data, sometimes things are repeated in different submissions. Rationalizing that whole system would be a welcome thing, I think, for everybody involved in pensions. I don't know if you've got a view, Chris.
Our famous last words, I suppose, but it shouldn't get any worse, should it?
This might be peak. This would be peak to the day.
But then people said that about tax simplification, I suppose. So, but on the face of it, very welcomed lower level of data submissions, particularly for the smaller schemes. And as you've referred to, the funding code is really difficult, probably a 50% uplift in the amount of work, form filling, data that trustees and employers need to deal with. So let's keep our fingers crossed that they could do what they say.
Yeah, no, I've just been thinking when you were talking just then, because, we've been talking a lot about, productive finance, the growth agenda, and that's driving lots of change in pension schemes, as people will know, around consolidation and value members. A lot of this is because of this growth agenda, and just hoping that these are other areas where this growth agenda is one thing, and whether we agree with it or whether I think it's successful is, again, something you can park to one side, but there might be some good outcomes that come on the back of it. So actually, this could be some quite good things with pension schemes. So we'll keep you updated as that develops. Okay, Chris, so Wednesday we have the spring update, a downgrade from the spring statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I'll just give a couple of quick thoughts from a sort of a pure pensions perspective, in the sense that we're not expecting anything seismic to happen on sort of taxation of pensions, so tax relief, tax-free cash, anything that people might sometimes get excited about in the lead up to budgets. There is very little expectation of anything particularly exciting, especially nothing about IHT. Torsten Bell, the minister, has already said previously that they're pressing ahead with the IHT things. I think I covered that last week with Cybe as well. So we're not expecting anything seismic from that perspective. But Chris, I don't know if you've got views on what might be said and from a more sort of broader macro perspective, what Rachel might say.
Yeah, I do. And arguably pensions, a lot of pension schemes wouldn't be worried about it because so many pension schemes have hedged well now and we've always said you shouldn't be calling movements in interest rates anyway. That's an unrewarded risk, but it's always interesting to see how things might move. And the way I see it from what we've heard in the news, and I'm not an economist or have any particular insight, but certainly it feels like the OBR is going to downgrade the growth forecast, so all the headroom's gone, and there's an expectation of, based on briefings and things we've heard of, quite a significant reining in of governance spending, whether that's welfare departments and everything else as well, potentially coupled with some additional spending on defence. So all that doesn't sound great for borrowing if it doesn't happen. So I think that would be the surprise. If there's an increase in defence spending and no announcement of tightening of the belt, possibly a potential little wobble on the creditworthiness of the UK government, which would in fact impact UK gilt yields, reducing hedging assets and reducing liabilities. So hedge schemes not a problem, but then we've got the potential for LDI, collateral calls and things that we have when bond yields move significantly. So if she does what's expected, it's probably all priced in. If she keeps her mouth shut and the OBR gives a negative forecast, perhaps we could see a little bit of a rise in yields.
Okay, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe if you like. Otherwise, I'll see you next week with my colleague, Rachel Titchin.